In the winter of 1921, Manitoba's average daily low ran below -30 Celsius for 11 consecutive weeks. That winter, most commercial apiaries in the region reported losses between 30 and 50% of their colonies. A small cluster of producers, 8 operations across 2 counties, reported losses below 5%. They were not working with different bee genetics, they were not using heated storage or any specialized commercial equipment. The single operational difference that the Ontario Department of Agriculture's regional survey documented was the way those producers managed moisture and airflow around the winter cluster. Specifically, the way they positioned ventilation to control not heat retention, but the movement of water vapor out of the hive body during the coldest weeks. That method appeared in the Ontario Agricultural Department's regional reports for 1921 and 1922. It was referenced in provincial extension bulletins through the early 1930s. By the mid-1940s, it had disappeared from published instruction, replaced by the standardized upper entrance ventilation approach that remains the dominant modern recommendation. The 8 Manitoba producers who survived that winter without losses were not lucky. They were managing a specific physical process inside the winter cluster that most beekeeping instruction, then and now, does not name, does not explain, and does not address. This video breaks down that process, the moisture biology of the winter cluster, and the ventilation geometry that the 1921 method got right when the standard approach got it wrong. The winter cluster is not simply a collection of bees generating heat. It is a metabolic system producing 2 outputs simultaneously: thermal energy and water vapor. Every bee in the cluster is respiring, converting stored honey into carbon dioxide, water, and heat through cellular metabolism. The heat is what the cluster needs. The water vapor is what the cluster must manage. In a cluster of 20,000 bees consuming approximately 30 pounds of honey through a northern winter, the metabolic water production is significant. Estimates from mid-20th century apicultural research suggest that a moderately sized winter cluster produces between 3 and 6 liters of water as vapor over the course of the winter season. That vapor has to go somewhere. In a well-ventilated hive, it moves upward through the cluster, exits through the upper hive body, and disperses into the ambient air outside the hive. In a poorly ventilated hive, or a hive ventilated in a way that traps moisture against the cluster rather than moving it outward, the vapor condenses on the cold surfaces of the hive interior, drips back onto the cluster, wets the bees, and triggers a thermal crisis. A wet cluster cannot maintain adequate temperature. The bees at the cluster surface that are chilled by cold condensate begin to slow their metabolic activity rather than increase it, and the cluster begins to lose heat faster than the bees at the center can generate it. The colony does not freeze. It dies of thermal dysregulation, a process that begins with moisture management failure, not with cold. The standard modern winter ventilation recommendation, a small upper entrance or notch in the inner cover, combined with a reduced lower entrance, addresses the moisture problem in theory, but frequently fails in practice at the extreme cold conditions that characterize the 1921 Manitoba winter. The logic of the standard recommendation is sound. Warm, moist air rises, exits through the upper opening, and is replaced by drier, cold air entering through the lower entrance, creating a convective flow that carries moisture out of the hive. At ambient temperatures between -5 and -15 Celsius, this convective system typically operates as intended. The temperature differential between the warm cluster interior and the cold hive exterior is sufficient to drive the vapor upward and outward before significant condensation occurs on the hive's inner surfaces. At -25 and below, the system breaks down in a specific and predictable way. The extreme temperature differential between the cluster surface and the inner cover creates a condensation zone directly above the cluster, precisely where the warmest, most moisture-laden air from the cluster's center is moving. The condensation rate at these temperatures exceeds the ventilation rate of the standard upper entrance, and water droplets begin to form and accumulate on the inner cover surface directly above the cluster, dripping down onto the bees in a cold rain that the convective ventilation system was supposed to prevent, but instead creates by concentrating the moisture at exactly the wrong location. The 1921 Ontario research that documented this condensation failure mode at extreme cold was not conducted in a laboratory. It was conducted in the operational apiaries of the Manitoba producers who had already found a partial solution through observation and trial, and whose colonies were surviving when their neighbors were not. The researchers spent 3 consecutive winters in those apiaries, measuring internal hive temperatures, relative humidity at multiple points within the hive body, and condensation accumulation at the inner cover and upper supersurfaces. What they found confirmed what the surviving producers had observed empirically. The standard upper entrance ventilation concentrated moisture at the inner cover rather than moving it out of the hive. And the producers who were surviving were doing something structurally different with their hive configuration that altered the moisture movement pathway. The difference was not the size of the ventilation opening. It was the direction of the primary airflow relative to the cluster geometry. The surviving producers had positioned their primary ventilation not at the top of the hive above the cluster, where condensation formed most aggressively, but at the side, specifically through a notched or partially open superrim at the level of the upper cluster surface rather than above it. This lateral positioning changed the condensation zone from a location directly above the cluster to a location at the hive wall, where condensate could drain downward along the inner surface without ever contacting the cluster below. The moisture movement physics that makes lateral ventilation more effective than vertical ventilation at extreme cold is specific enough to explain precisely why the 1921 Manitoba producers' approach worked and why the standard upper entrance approach failed in their conditions. In a vertically ventilated hive, the warmest and most moisture-laden air rises directly from the cluster center toward the inner cover. As this air meets the cold inner cover surface, which at -30 ambient temperature may be at or below 0 Celsius even with the cluster generating heat below it, water vapor condenses at the coldest point in the system, which is the inner cover directly above the cluster. The condensate accumulates until it drips. In a laterally ventilated hive, the warm, moist air rising from the cluster center encounters the lateral opening at the upper cluster level before it reaches the inner cover. Some of that air exits laterally, carrying vapor outward before condensation can occur. The remainder rises to the inner cover, but the vapor pressure of the air at the inner cover has already been reduced by the lateral exit, and the remaining condensate forms on the inner cover edges and upper superwalls rather than directly above the cluster center. The physical result is that the cluster sits in a drier air environment at its upper surface, the surface most vulnerable to cold condensate drip, while still maintaining adequate heat retention in the cluster body below. This is not a marginal difference at -30. It is the difference between a dry cluster and a wet one. The practical implementation that the 1921 Manitoba producers were using, and that the Ontario research subsequently formalized and documented, involved a specific modification to the hive configuration that required no purchased equipment and no specialized materials. A notch or opening approximately 1 inch high and 2 to 3 inches wide was cut or created at the junction of the upper super's lower rim and the super below it, not at the inner cover level, but one super height below it at the level of the upper cluster surface. In standard Langstroth equipment, this placed the lateral opening at the top of the super immediately surrounding the winter cluster, where the warmest air was accumulating before rising to the condensation zone. This opening faced south or southeast in the Manitoba apiaries, taking advantage of solar warming during the brief daylight hours of the northern winter to assist vapor movement outward. The lower entrance was reduced to a single B-width opening for ventilation and flight access on warm days. The inner cover's notch, which in the standard configuration served as the primary moisture exit, was kept closed or minimally open, shifting the primary ventilation from the vertical top exit configuration to the lateral mid-hive configuration. The total ventilation area was not dramatically different from the standard setup. The geometry was entirely different, and the geometry was what determined where condensation formed and whether it reached the cluster below. The condensation management that the lateral ventilation achieved had a secondary benefit that the 1921 Ontario researchers documented, but that modern beekeeping instruction has not incorporated. It significantly reduced the moisture loading on the winter cluster's honey stores. In a vertically ventilated hive experiencing condensation events, dripping condensate from the inner cover falls into uncapped cells and uncapped honey in the upper cluster area, diluting the honey with water. Diluted honey has a lower sugar concentration and a higher susceptibility to fermentation, and fermented honey consumed by the winter cluster contributes to dysentery, which stresses the bees, accelerates their depletion of fat body reserves, and shortens the lifespan of the winter bee cohort. The lateral ventilation approach, by reducing condensate formation directly above the cluster, reduced the frequency and volume of condensate contact with the cluster's honey stores. The Manitoba producers who survived the 1921 winter with minimal losses were not just losing fewer bees to cold and moisture. They were maintaining better honey store quality through the winter, which meant their surviving bees emerged from the cluster in spring with less dysentery damage and more effective fat body reserve utilization. The moisture management benefit compounded into better spring buildup performance as well as better winter survival, a second downstream consequence of the ventilation geometry that the standard configuration cannot produce because it creates the condensate drip the lateral approach prevents. The Ontario Agricultural Department's formalization of the 1921 method in its regional bulletins introduced a specific assessment protocol that the Manitoba producers had been using informally, a winter moisture check that required no hive opening and no frame disturbance. On a cold, clear day, when the ambient temperature was below -10 Celsius and the cluster was generating heat, the beekeeper positioned himself within 2 feet of the hive's front face and observed the condensation pattern on the outer hive surfaces. In a hive with adequate lateral ventilation, a faint visible moisture or frost pattern appeared at the lateral opening position, indicating that vapor was exiting at the correct point. No condensation appeared at the inner cover level or at the hive top. In a hive with inadequate lateral ventilation, the condensation pattern reversed. Minimal or no visible moisture at the lateral position, and visible frost or moisture at the top corners and inner cover edges, indicating that vapor was accumulating at the upper hive before exiting, with condensation forming at the inner cover directly above the cluster. This external observation required approximately 30 seconds per hive and provided a direct diagnostic of the internal moisture movement pattern without any hive disturbance, which, at -30 temperatures, was not a trivial consideration, since opening a hive at extreme cold breaks the cluster's thermal integrity and can trigger a cold shock that kills bees at the outer cluster surface. The historical documentation of the 1921 Manitoba method in the Ontario Agricultural Department bulletins of 1922 and 1923 includes comparative data that provides the clearest quantitative evidence available for the ventilation geometry's practical impact on winter survival. The survey covered 47 commercial operations across the Manitoba region in the winter of 1921 to 1922. Of the 8 operations using the lateral ventilation configuration, the average winter loss was 4.3%. Of the 39 operations using the standard upper entrance configuration, the average winter loss was 36.8%. The temperature conditions were comparable across all operations. All experienced the same -30 conditions during the critical January and February weeks. The difference in outcome was entirely attributable to the ventilation configuration, which determined whether condensate formed at the inner cover above the cluster or at the lateral hive wall away from the cluster. The 32-point differential is one of the largest ventilation-related survival effects documented in the North American commercial beekeeping record, and it was produced by a geometric modification that required a handsaw and 15 minutes of work per hive. The bulletin that documented it noted explicitly that the method was not patentable, required no purchase inputs, and could be implemented by any beekeeper with existing equipment. This characteristic, free, simple, and effective, is consistent with every other management practice in this series that subsequently disappeared from published instruction. The specific condensation dynamics that produce the 1921 lateral ventilation's advantage can be made more precise with 2 physical principles that help explain why the geometry matters at extreme cold, but not at moderate cold. The first principle is dew point depression. The dew point of the air inside a winter cluster, the temperature at which the warm, moist cluster air will begin to condense, is primarily determined by the vapor content of that air. In a cluster consuming honey at a moderate rate in moderate cold, the vapor production rate is low enough that the cluster air's dew point remains well below the inner cover temperature, and condensation does not occur regardless of ventilation geometry. At extreme cold, honey consumption accelerates as the cluster generates more heat to maintain core temperature. Vapor production increases proportionally. The dew point of the cluster air rises, and at -30 ambient, the inner cover temperature drops close enough to the elevated dew point that condensation begins. The second principle is vapor pressure gradient. Vapor moves from high pressure to low pressure, from inside the cluster toward the ventilation openings. A lateral opening at the upper cluster level creates a shorter vapor pathway from the cluster to the outside than an opening at the top of the hive does. Shorter pathway means faster vapor transit, which means lower vapor accumulation inside the hive at any given production rate. At extreme cold, where the balance between vapor production and vapor removal tips toward condensation, this shorter pathway is what keeps the balance on the right side. 2 implementation errors undermine the lateral ventilation approach, even in beekeepers who understand its principle and intend to apply it correctly. The first error is opening size. A lateral opening larger than approximately 3 inches wide at extreme cold temperatures allows too much cold air to enter the hive body horizontally, creating a cross-ventilation effect that draws heat from the cluster surface rather than just removing vapor. The Manitoba producers who used this method consistently described the correct opening as just wide enough to allow a bee to pass, enough to create a vapor pathway without creating a cold air draft across the cluster surface. The opening width that works in this context is counterintuitively narrow. 1 to 2 inches wide is typically adequate at temperatures below -20, and wider openings increase heat loss beyond what the cluster can compensate. The second error is opening position. The lateral opening must be at the upper cluster surface level, at the level where the warmest, most vapor-laden air is accumulating before rising to the condensation zone. An opening positioned below the cluster creates an entrance rather than a ventilation pathway, admitting cold air into the brood chamber space rather than extracting warm vapor from the cluster surface. An opening positioned above the cluster level, between the cluster's upper surface and the inner cover, is too close to the condensation zone and allows the inner cover to continue accumulating condensate despite the lateral opening's presence. The correct position is precisely at the level of the cluster's warm upper surface, where the vapor pathway is shortest and the condensate formation risk is lowest. The disappearance of the 1921 lateral ventilation method from published beekeeping instruction followed a pattern that differs slightly from the other practices described in this series, in a way that is worth noting specifically. Most of the practices covered in earlier videos disappeared because they were replaced by purchased alternatives. Foundation replaced drawn comb management. Synthetic miticides replaced brood breaks. Commercial syrup replaced summer pollen protocol timing. The 1921 wintering method did not disappear because it was replaced by a purchased alternative. It disappeared because the standardization of equipment design in North American commercial beekeeping after the Second World War produced a default hive configuration, the inner cover with a notched upper entrance, that embodied the vertical ventilation approach. As this configuration became the standard, instruction built around it, and the lateral ventilation modification became an undocumented deviation from standard equipment, rather than a named and taught alternative. Beekeepers who had never learned the lateral method had no reason to deviate from the standard configuration, and beekeepers who had learned it from the 1922 bulletins were aging out of the teaching population by the 1950s. The method did not lose a commercial argument to a competitor. It lost a generational argument to forgetting. The physical principles it was built on are unchanged. The extreme cold conditions it was designed for occur every winter across northern apiaries. And the standard upper entrance configuration it was designed to replace continues to produce the condensate drip that it was specifically developed to prevent. For beekeepers in temperate climates, where winter lows rarely exceed -15 Celsius, the lateral ventilation modification may produce marginal benefit over the standard configuration. The condensation dynamics at those temperatures are generally manageable with upper entrance ventilation, and the standard approach works adequately in most seasons. The 1921 method is specifically calibrated to conditions where the condensation failure mode of the standard configuration becomes acute. Sustained temperatures below -20 Celsius, extended periods with limited solar warming of the hive exterior, and high cluster metabolic demand from the extreme cold. In these conditions, which describe the northern tier of North American beekeeping from Manitoba through the northern Great Plains, the upper Midwest, and northern New England, the lateral ventilation geometry is not an incremental improvement. It is the difference between the 36% loss rate of the standard configuration and the 4% loss rate of the lateral configuration that the 1921 survey documented. For beekeepers outside these extreme cold zones, the most directly applicable element of the 1921 research is the external condensation diagnostic, observing the frost and moisture pattern on the outer hive surfaces on cold, clear days to assess whether the hive's internal vapor movement is occurring at the lateral wall or at the inner cover. This diagnostic is valid regardless of climate zone and provides a non-invasive tool for assessing winter hive function that most contemporary beekeepers have never encountered. The winter cluster in your apiary is managing moisture right now. Every bee in every cluster is respiring, generating water vapor, and depending on the hive's ventilation geometry to move that vapor outward before it condenses and drips. In most winters in most climates, the standard upper entrance configuration manages this adequately, and the condensation events that occur are minor enough that the colony absorbs them without critical loss. In the coldest weeks of a northern winter, the sustained -25 and -30 periods that test the physical limits of the standard approach, The standard configuration's condensation failure mode becomes the primary driver of colony loss. Not starvation, not mite load, not bee genetics. The moisture moving in the wrong direction at the wrong rate, condensing at the worst possible location, dripping cold water onto the cluster that most needs to stay dry and warm. The 1921 Manitoba producers found the ventilation geometry that solved this problem through observation, documented it through careful outcome comparison across 11 winters, and produced a modification that any beekeeper can implement with a handsaw in 15 minutes before the cold sets in. The Ontario Agricultural Department researchers confirmed the physics and published the data in 1922 and 1923. The generational chain that would have carried that knowledge forward broke in the 1940s. The physics did not change. The cluster is still producing the same vapor. The condensation is still forming at the same location. The lateral opening that redirects it away from the cluster is still the same modification. Leave a comment with what temperatures your apiary typically reaches in the coldest weeks and how you currently manage winter ventilation. And subscribe if this kind of historically grounded, biology-first beekeeping is what brought you here.